Oh, no, not to worry, Hannah. Not to worry at all. No, we're getting ramped up to it, and this will be recorded, so you'll have access to it there as well. Yeah, just to say that this is a really fluid set of circumstances here. I think one of the things I hope that endures from this global event that we're experiencing all together, each in our own ways, one thing that I hope endures is that when people are sick, you don't feel obliged to go into school or go into work and infect the people around you. Yeah. And in terms of the way this course will be put together, the course notes will, as always, as I always have in all my courses, they are available on Blackboard. That may affect how you take notes in the course. All of my lecture notes will be available to you verbatim. How I would take that personally if I were a student in the course is that I'd feel liberated to take notes that aren't so much a scribing of what's being said. If you are sparked in terms of your own critical thinking and maybe think about something you might want to include in an essay. I've done that in classes in the past. Say, oh, geez, that sparks an idea. Write down those notes. Do a bit of writing that might be included in your essay later on. That might be good use of your time in terms of how you take your notes. But all the notes will be available on Blackboard. The lecture is being recorded. The discussion is being recorded. So you can go back to that after the fact as well. And I think, you know, in terms of, again, the fluidity of this set of circumstances, you know, you shouldn't feel obliged to have to be in class if you're feeling unwell. You know, stay home and make sure that your peers and your profs are well also. I'm especially fastidious about this right now because I'm also coaching the varsity Nordic skiing team, and we're working under really stringent requirements in terms of rapid testing, with the athletes having to sequester themselves from practices for 2.5 weeks if any one of them tests positive. So they're on edge about that now. We're just into our race season. We've had 3 seasons disrupted at this point. So we really don't want to blow this race season as well. So I'm still kind of bubbled up. The athletes are still bubbled up. So let's be good to one another. Let's be considerate to one another in that way. Okay? Any questions on that? Sort of matter of housekeeping? No? What else? We're into the course now, a month into the course. Good day. And you should be thinking about your essay proposal. Oh, excuse me, miss, before you tuck in there, let me pass something on to you. Oh, you can hand it on. Hey, thank you. You should be thinking about your essay proposal at this point. I would expect around about now you've looked ahead in the readings and in the topics, found something that's of interest to you. If you're having trouble on that front, you know, I've distributed essay assignment with some suggested topics there. Feel free to pick up one of those if you like. I would strongly encourage you to find something that's of interest to you. Essays that are written, good day, sir, here you go. Essays that are written out of a point of interest are generally more interesting to the readers too. And these are kind of argumentative essays. You need to make a point. You need to convince your readers, your reader in this case. And it's always easier to do that if you're enthused about what you're writing about. So I hope you found something that's of interest to you in the course reading so far, that you've settled into a topic, and that you're working your way towards your essay proposal. I'm stoked at this particular moment in that I just completed my first book chapter proposal of the semester, and after class I'm getting ready to press send it off to the editor of a volume. That's always kind of a daunting moment too. You know, that moment when you hand it in, you know you're going to catch a typo immediately after you send whatever assignment is in. But it's also exciting to get it off your desk and on to being published and read by others in the world. All right. We're a small enough class. Any questions about that, sort of the housekeeping matters in the course? Assignments coming up, readings coming up. I will mention that we are 1 week behind in the readings. I'm not fussed by that at all. It gives you a chance maybe to read ahead. In terms of the exam, and the exam format that I mentioned last time when we were still kind of up in the air as to whether we're going back, it will be the same. It will be a take-home exam. It will be 2 essays out of a choice of 4 or 5. And what that means for you and in terms of how we move through this course material together, is that you're not obliged to cover the whole breadth of the course when it comes to the exam. You can focus your energies in a little bit. It is a very long reading list. I hope that you move through all of the materials, but I would expect that you would move through some in more depth and detail than others. So that exam format, the coursework format, allows you to do that, to find things that are of particular interest to you and zoom in on those. So whether it's international terrorism or whether it's Canada's place in the world, you can find what's of interest to you in the course and settle into those arguments. We will get through Grant, we will get through Buyers, those books that you've purchased. All the rest, though, are online sources, so they're relatively accessible and no cost to you. So just to let you know, if we don't move through all of the course materials, you're not obliged to know all but what you're focused on in your exam essay questions, and obviously in your essay as well. Okay, any questions on that, friend? All right, we're a small enough group here, and I hope to engage in lively discussion amongst ourselves today and throughout. Now that we're back together, this is easier than staring into a computer screen. Sorry, Hannah, although you're coming back the next time, it sounds like. So I thought we'd do some introductions. I'd like to get to know your name, and this is important. I've taught classes of 250, 300 students. Speaking into the abyss is kind of it's a different sort of experience. I want to engage in discussions with you, both in terms of your essay and in terms of in-class discussions or office discussions. So let's get to know one another, and so you can get to know your peers also. I think one strength of a small undergraduate degree is that you can form strong cohort relationships through the course. When our students graduate in the fourth year, you do see real peer groups and collegiality forming there. And I'm especially pleased this year that we can get back together, because our custom in the political science program is to invite all the fourth year students out to the cabin on the Wassy River there where we're encamped, along with all the poli-sci profs, so that we could enjoy some time on the deck together, share in big ideas together, throw some axes together, and maybe lift heavy things. Whenever I see like really capable people in one place, I always think, like, what could we do together? Like, could we move something really large or something like this? The things that I couldn't do on my own. So just be forewarned, your energies may be enlisted on that front later on, but the long and short of it, the takeaway here is the forming of those peer groups is really important. I think back to my undergraduate education, those relations that I still have, like, for example, with Professor Tabachnik, were perhaps as meaningful as any of the course content that I took from it. So hooray that we're back together, and then we can talk amongst ourselves in this natural and human way. So let's go around the room. I'd just like to know your name, so I can maybe start to learn it as more than an email address, and why you're interested in political science. Perhaps starting here, sir.
My name's Aiden, and I just kind of took it because I thought it was interesting. I knew nothing about politics before.
Okay. Yeah, it's a common refrain. I think there's like a half course in civics at the high school level. You don't see political science courses there. I didn't encounter them myself. So you had one civics course, basically, and it wasn't particularly impactful. Okay. And so, yeah, we get a lot of students coming from other disciplines, just not being aware of political science. And Aiden? Good to have you here, Aiden. Yeah. Sir?
My name is Luciano, and I just like politics.
Have you been involved in politics in terms of reading in the news? Or
Sorry?
have you been involved in politics yourself, or in terms of reading about it in the news? Excellent, excellent. And I would assume, it's good to hear, Luciano, I would assume that all of you kind of have your eyes open to the world, that you're reading several news sources. It's so easy now, where we don't have to have actual subscriptions to newspapers to get a breadth of sources. Just shout out, feel free. What are we reading? What are our news sources here in the room? Where do you get your news from? Luciano?
Basically everything, CNN, Fox News,
Okay. Those main media outlets there? Yeah. Any others? Where are you getting your news from?
Like social media.
Social media? Okay, yeah.
Like TikTok.
Okay, interesting.
Well, not really. Like, that was just, like, that's not really news, but, like social media, like, I don't know, Twitter, even Instagram.
Yeah. You know what? This is more and more the case. I don't want to diminish this because there's something very real to this, that people do get their news through social media. And that arguably has real distinctive effects on the attitudes that are shaped. Those algorithms feed back the opinions that we may be inclined to accept as our own. They may sort of point us towards those hot button issues that everyone is talking about. And it's interesting to see, even in the mainstream news outlets like CBC, for example, the use of Twitter and Instagram as like the sources that are pointed to as the references. What did Poliver say yesterday on Twitter? Or what sort of video did he post up on his Instagram? Or name the politician. So that's fair. Anything else? Where are we getting our news from? Multiple sources? Yeah, sure.
Like the New York Times and stuff.
New York Times is fantastic, of course. Yeah. Interesting, if you think back to like Chomsky's critique of mass media as having a filtering effect in terms of what we take on and what's considered an acceptable viewpoint. Chomsky criticizes the New York Times as sort of towing the establishment line. And now, in terms of American political discourse, at least, it's sort of been crowded to the left in terms of how that ideological spectrum looks presently. Yeah. Yeah, at the back there, please. Excellent, excellent. Je ne parle pas français, but we try, yeah? But it's great to have a francophone in the class and different perspectives there, even in terms of the Canadian political scene, obviously. All right. Yeah, Gavin?
I was going to say news aggregates.
Aggregates, yeah.
Yeah, even, I guess, Reddit, but in a certain specific way. You can look up, use Reddit. There's subreddits for each country, so if you're interested in a country, you can go to that subreddit, and they'll have local news about what's happening in that country.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get a pretty good, and you also have people commenting in the aggregate, so you'll see their perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the comment section is its own thing, isn't it, in terms of the rules that govern. Can they be anonymous? Do you have to attach your name to them? Some of those comment sections, like on Breitbart News, are particularly insidious in terms of far-right political discourses. Yep.
There's this one called Ground News that's also like an aggregate.
I haven't heard of
and
this.
It shows a bunch of different news sources, and it shows what their political leaning and bias is.
Okay.
So if you're looking at a story, say the Freedom Convoy,
Yeah.
it shows what the left-wing Canadian media is showing, what the right-wing Canadian media is showing, or what media in other countries is saying about the same topic.
Mm-hmm. And we will talk about that in a moment, actually. This Freedom Convoy has shown up in the international media. The BBC, for example, has taken that up as a lead story. I think that was yesterday. Anyways, thanks for sparking that question, Luciano. Good to have you in the class. And at the bare minimum, we need to have our eyes open to the world. That's the expectation of this course. We'll talk about the topics of the day. The expectation for the course is that you know the primary sources on the reading list, but we'll use those theoretical frameworks in order to understand these current events. Yeah. All right, Miss.
I'm Sydney. I'm taking this class because I'm actually a history student, and I felt that doing political science, they kind of go hand in hand, so I just thought I could learn more.
Excellent, excellent. We get a lot of students coming from history, actually. Many come in through the Great Political Questions courses that are cross-listed in history. Right? So, Sydney,
Yes.
good to have you in the class, Sydney. Yeah, Miss?
My name is
Irene? Ayuneen. Am I saying that right? Ayuneen? Ayumin. Okay, Ayumi. Thank you. Okay.
I'm an exchange student from Osaka, Japan. My major was international relations in my home university, and I especially study how globalization affects people's identity. And then I'm really interested in that field. That's why I decided to take this course.
Well, that matches up quite nicely with the topics at hand here. Good to have you in the class, and welcome to Canada. I hope your experience here is a good one, Ayumi. Yeah.
My name is Juri Tamura.
Could you say that again, please?
Juri.
Jury.
Yes.
Okay.
Juri. And I'm also exchange student from Japan. And the reason why I take this course is because I also learned about international relations in my home
Excellent. Again, very, very good reason to be here. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
My name is Kennedy, and I took this course because I'm really interested in international affairs and globalization, and specifically how it relates to solving issues like climate change.
Yeah, that will be a pressing concern for us throughout the course, that we have these big global issues that national governments seem incapable of confronting on their own, the issues that require global coordination. So that's really at the center of the topic itself. All right, good to have you here, Kennedy. Yeah. Please, yeah, miss.
My name is Kotori, and I'm from Japan, and I was curious. I have a little information about globalization in Japan, so I just um, want to understand more. So I just take this class.
Excellent. Well, we've got many extensions from Japan here.
Same with my students.
Okay, okay. Well, you got good company then too. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, please.
I'm Anji, E-N-J-I, and I'm
Anji.
also a exchange student like Maya,
Yeah.
but from South Korea. Also, the reason why I'm in this class is that actually my major was the public administration in my home university. And when I learned about it and learned about like governance, I felt that I had to know about other countries and I have to know about globalization, and that's why I'm in this class.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Good to have you with us. And the public admin, we have courses on the books. We have administrative officers from the city who sometimes come in and teach them. We're not teaching as many of them presently, but it's good to hear that there's that background and that interest here. In terms of comparing this country and that kind of within political science falls within the subdiscipline of comparative politics. How do the healthcare systems in this country compare to the healthcare systems in this country, that kind of thing. Here we're focused on the coordinated efforts, multilateral efforts, especially between various nations as we confront these shared problems. But thanks for that. Yeah, sir?
My name's Mike. Took this course because I didn't really know a whole lot about politics, but it's kind of interesting.
Okay.
I learned a bit from it.
I hope so too, Mike. I hope so too. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I took this class because I like politics, but mainly because I needed a humanities course.
Fair enough. Yeah.
For my major.
Yeah.
But I do like studying.
Okay. You know what? I understand that there's elements of intrinsic value and extrinsic value that motivate human beings. And sometimes we need to be mercenary about things. We're doing this because of this very discrete reason. Okay. Very good. Yeah.
I'm Andrew. I'm in business, but I want to do a minor in political science.
Okay. Interesting.
It's a
Interesting.
mandatory course, but I really enjoy politics, so it's just,
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
I'm Gavin. I'm in political science, and so I need this class to graduate.
And you're kind of doing it backwards because I've had you in a number of classes, Gavin. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess in third year, and this is the first year class.
Yeah. That's how I did things in my undergraduate too. I did the first year poli-sci last. We've been encouraged to have that flexibility for students in terms of scheduling. It's a curious way around about it, but we'll get there. We'll get there. All right. Yes, we will, Gavin. All right. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm in third year. I also didn't know that I needed this course to graduate because I originally came for history, as a history major, but then I took first year power and the common good, and so that kind of convinced me to change over. But yeah, I just like politics, political theory, political history.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. And that will be a focus here, Maria. We've got the international relations, but also the emphasis on political theory or political philosophy will be prominent too. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Maria.
My name's Audrey. I'm also a third year student. I decided to take pretty much a third year students kind of grouped together. I'm actually criminal justice. I took this class because I changed my major from policing, so I wasn't supposed to be here next year. I was going to go to Canada. So now I've kind of taken all the criminal justice classes because I really bunched them all together. But I've always been interested in political science and kind of international
Very good. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm Sarah. I'm in business administration, and I took this because I needed another course, and I thought it'd be interesting.
Good. Eyes wide open to the world, hopefully. Yeah, very good. Thanks, Sarah. All right. Again, hopefully you get to know one another, form some friendships out of the class. And that's important just because it's pleasant to have friends and peers, obviously, but also because you can't do politics by yourself. And so if you want to organize politically, whether on a campus level or beyond, it's important to have those strong peer networks, yeah, so that you can cooperate and coordinate your actions together. And I am always impressed when students do that, when you actually act. Yeah? This is important in order to, I think, realize our political natures and make our communities better as a result. One of the neat things about political science is that we're studying something that we're a part of. And so you can't really be indifferent to it. It tends to cultivate strong emotions. Yeah? It's not like studying rocks. Yeah? We're a part of it and are very shaping of it. Even to say what counts as a suitable object of study frames the political reality. So within international relations, we've talked before about the focus upon states, the state-centric focus that's been predominant in international relations. That's contestable as our most political terms. Why do we focus on states to the neglect of non-state actors? Whether they're, hey, good day, come on in. Non-state actors, whether they're non-governmental organizations, whether they're, oh, excuse me, sir, before you tuck in, here's a reading for you. Yeah, you're welcome. And your name is? Andrew. Andrew, good to have you with us, Andrew. Yeah, this is a contestable question here too. What should we study? And it's clear that by saying international relations is about this and not that, you preclude certain possibilities or open up others. Again, these terms are contestable. There are these big perennial questions that were raised 2,500 years ago within the Western tradition, weren't settled then, won't be settled in any decisive way presently, except to the extent that we engage in those debates, make the ideas our own, and settle upon our own positions. And hopefully to do that in an informed and civil sort of way is the aim here. So this becomes a political space. And this is not political science may be a bit of a misnomer in that sense, that politics happens within the discipline as well, even in terms of defining what counts as political. All right, good to get to know one another. Staying on the discussion side before we dive into the topic of globalization and international terrorism, which we'll engage with today, I do want to have a brief discussion about this so-called Freedom Convoy that has been making international news, that is now encamped in our nation's capital in Ottawa. The people see it moving through North Bay, yeah? My hometown calendar was closed off to that traffic. The OPP actually closed the exit from the highway there, and there were barriers set up at Calendar as well, so we didn't see it quite so locally there. I'd just like to begin with some reflections on that event, that ongoing event, and I'm interested in your perspectives here as well in terms of the significance that we would draw from that. What does it mean? And just on the surface, which is a good way to begin, the rallying cry has been freedom, and the supposed abridgments of freedom as Canada and other nations have tried to come to terms with this global pandemic that we're all experiencing, with an emphasis obviously on public health measures that we're all adopting even presently to this day. And so there's a great deal of chafing at those restrictions, perhaps understandably, and I don't think anybody's really enjoyed going through all of this together. This has been in various ways, traumatic event for us all in different ways, but there's certainly been a degree of unpleasantness, and everyone's looking forward to getting back to normal, whatever that normal looks like, and in terms of how this could be a transformative event institutionally and provincially and nationally and internationally as well. And so I think a great deal of that resistance, you can point to the vaccine mandate required for truckers re-entering Canada as a kind of original cause, but I think it goes far beyond that. if I were to generalize, it's this rallying cry, freedom contra these restrictions, public health mandates, like masking, for example, or like vaccine requirements and so on. We're all familiar with these. With the protesters on Parliament Hill waving around copies of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and pointing to obvious abridgments of those freedoms, like mobility rights, for example, like rights to peaceful assembly, although those are being enjoyed still presently. And considering, as we all should, that those rights in the Charter are not sacrosanct, they can be limited within the constraints of a free and democratic society and given reasonable justification. But that seems to be the rallying cry in my mind, freedom. And I'd just like to point out that at the root of it, there's two ways of characterizing our understanding of freedom, within political theory at least. There's what's referred to as, oh, I missed Hannah. Before we get into two forms of freedom, Hannah, we didn't miss you there. I'm sorry, I was just talking to the class. Could you introduce yourself, please, Hannah? Does that work? Okay, maybe not. We'll come back to Hannah. We'll come back to Hannah here. All right. Two forms of freedom. Negative freedom. Negative freedom. And positive freedom. Positive freedom. And I think that the kind of freedom that's in the minds of these protesters is what we would refer to as negative freedom. That is the freedom from, as opposed to the freedom to. Freedom from restraints. The freedom from restrictions. Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, author of Leviathan and one of the first intellectual kind of architects of the state, the modern state, Thomas Hobbes, defines freedom as the absence of external impediments. Freedom is the absence of external impediments. You can do whatever you want. Nothing gets in your way. Yeah? And Hobbes says that by our nature, human beings are essentially free in our, what he calls the state of nature. Prior to these artifices of institutions and states and laws and norms and customs, human beings could do whatever they want. That there are no natural laws, that we're, again, essentially free. Even if that means being free to trespass upon your neighbor, to steal, to kill, what have you. There's nothing unnatural about that according to Hobbes, because we're essentially free beings. But recognizing that that's not really a sustainable way of living. It may be a choice whether to be entirely free yourself, but you don't want everyone else around you to be free in that sense of having the license to do whatever they want. In light of that, any rational human being would say we will abridge some of our perfect freedom, admit the laws of the state, whatever those happen to be, in order to enjoy a modicum of security, so that we can go about enjoying our freedoms as we like in our private lives, to the extent that we don't trespass upon others, stepping on the toes of others. That's a kind of classical liberal understanding of what constitutes freedom in this negative sense. And I think that's in part what these protesters are advocating for. Yeah? A sense of positive freedom, another way of describing this is the freedom to participate in the formation of the laws by which you'll live. I think the Greek word autonomy sums this up quite nicely. Auto, self, nomos, law, to make laws for yourself. According to this positive conception of freedom, you're free, not when you just do whatever. You're free when you say, here are the laws by which I will live. And you can imagine that even at the level of the individual. Maybe early on in the early days of the pandemic, binge watching Tiger King and eating ice cream seemed like the thing to do, and you realize at a point that, no, this is not a sustainable way to live. I need to make some sort of order, some rules for my own life, even at the level of the individual, in order to have an enjoyable life. autonomy is an expression of freedom understood in this positive sense. And I think that's partly what's being neglected in these protests, is the consideration that we as a community decide, here are the rules by which we will live, largely, I think, born out of recognition of our fellow citizens. You know, we're rather young here, I hope healthy, robust human beings. We recognize that perhaps although there may be sort of threats, consequences of this particular virus to us, in large part we've done this, we've accepted these sacrifices for others. Yeah? The elderly, the infirm, making sure that ICUs and hospitals aren't overwhelmed with COVID patients. I think that's been the messaging pretty consistently from public health authorities. We're doing this for our community as a whole, realizing that if we were on the other side of things, if we were in that compromised position, we would hope that others would make sacrifices for us too. Yeah? So we live by the laws because we, as reasonable human beings, think of them as being decent, yeah? As not only providing for our immediate security and private benefit, but providing for the common good. Yeah? We think about the common good before we think about our own private appetitive interests. And that would be akin to the kind of classical Greek conception of autonomy as what freedom really means. Now, it matters then very much the extent to which we participate in those debates that frame the laws by which we'll live. Yeah? And so that becomes important. To what extent do we have a say? Yeah? And to what extent do we actually participate in those debates? This becomes important there. So I think this is at the core of what's going on. In my view, as a political theorist, this is what I see as a sort of contested sense of what do we mean by freedom, if that's their rallying cry. You know, if it's the freedom to get drunk in public and pee on public monuments, you know, that's freedom as license, the freedom to do whatever you want. But no one would choose to live in a community where human beings behave in that sort of barbaric way, is how I see it. You know, these have been the hot button issues in terms of social media representation. You know, the desecration of the monument to the unknown soldier in Ottawa, and the desecration of the Terry Fox statue. Terry Fox, I figure, really important to Canadians, you know, battling cancer, raising funds for cancer by trying to run across the country as an amputee. The desecration of that image, I think, affected a lot of Canadians really, really deeply. So, you know, we've been focused on those sorts of issues, but I think at core there is this question of, well, what do you mean by freedom? And how, you know, I think about it too in the context of residents of Ottawa at this point who are living through that essentially occupation of their neighborhoods. Maria, you had a hand up.
I was just gonna say, like, really quick, I saw, like, this morning that there was, like, protesters that, like, cleaned up the Terry Fox, like, monument, and the, what was the other monument? The cenotaph. Yeah, there was, like, people, like, scrubbing it and, like, picking up garbage. It was nice to see.
Good.
Just a little side note.
Yeah.
I mean, it is notable that it wasn't until they were shamed in international media that they ever felt compelled to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
How could we
But,
first place?
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, well, who knows who did in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
But-
Interesting. Okay. Well, and then too, you know, if you're dealing with such a large gathering as that, largely leaderless, you know, without any really established institutional structure, how do you keep everyone marching in the same direction? You know, if that's the cause, you know, freedom and an end to public health mandates, how do you deal with these hangers-on? Some rather more unsavory than others, and that's been part of the whole media discourse as well. How is the far right involved in this? How are sort of neo-fascists involved in this? Not to paint the group with one brush, but there has been evidence of that as well. Yeah.
A lot of the organizers are, one of them was on social media talking about purity of bloodlines. So it's kind of a little difficult to say when one of the organizers is talking about that kind of language. And it wasn't, maybe he was talking about Anglo-Saxon bloodlines. You know, he's a white supremacist.
Hmm.
There isn't really ambiguity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of peculiar how things have gone about in Ottawa. How there's, you know, obviously the difference between how the police have treated other protests and this protest.
Yeah. Yeah.
And often we see the police chief say it's a peaceful protest. You know, throwing rocks at an ambulance is a violent action.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that he's saying they're peaceful, but then when asked about whether they're dispersed, well, they're too dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be both.
Yeah, a couple of really good points raised there. You know, disparities in terms of treatment of protests by BIPOC protesters compared to the treatment of these largely white protesters. Yeah, kind of an affinity between the police and the protesters there. You know, mugging for photos with the protesters. That was concerning. The press release from Ottawa Police yesterday, I believe it was, you know, underlining the cost, $800,000 a day of policing the protest. And yet at the same time throwing up their hands and saying we can't do anything to ticket vehicles. I lived in Ottawa for 10 years. Has anyone lived in Ottawa before? No? It is one of the most, a friend called it the city that fun forgot. It's a nice city. It's a very pleasant city, very pretty city. A little bit prissy, a little bit like they're setting a good example for the rest of the country. You know? And parking is a huge issue. There are all kinds of rules for parking. If it's 2 hours, pardon?
I was going to say navigation itself is a huge issue.
Oh.
You can go in a circle in Ottawa and not even know you're going in a circle.
With the one-way streets and all, and
Oh yeah, it's so
a lot of rules. It's a very rule-bound city. And if you leave your vehicle past 2 hours in a 2-hour parking zone, you will get a ticket for it. So residents have said, this is remarkable. I can't park for 2 hours and 10 minutes outside my apartment and not get a ticket. And now someone's parked a diesel semi-trailer on a one-way street, and they're not getting ticketed or towed. Why is that?
pretty much the block around Parliament is closed. My best friend lives like across the street, and she's like, it's absolute chaos. She doesn't want to leave her apartment because she doesn't know what's going on because there's noises coming from everywhere.
Very loud, the smells of diesel exhaust. It's definitely impactful upon the residents of those neighborhoods. I was just booking accommodations for a ski team in Ottawa, and the manager is already apologetic at saying it's going to take you a long time to drive into the city, so the mobility rights, if you will, of those citizens is being impacted there. Yeah, and with questions as to, well, if you can't deal with this, what is that $800,000 really doing here? Yeah? Questions on that front. Any other comments or observations on the event? Yeah, please.
I can't wait to see what Justin Trudeau does. I don't think he's going to face them like the protesters.
Well, considering the way that they've directly threatened him, and you know, the mantra is there. It's not an audience that someone would willingly entertain. His comments yesterday, you know, the tinfoil hat comment was, I don't think particularly helpful in terms of moderating the civil discourse around the event. And it's been interesting to see how it's played out in terms of the Conservative Party leadership, with it appears fragmenting, with, you know, calling the leaders you know, into question, O'Toole's leadership into question. That will come up for vote, I think, tomorrow, with Poilievre and others aligning themselves with the movement as a way to appeal to a base, a populist base, with the apprehension that the Conservative Party, the federal Conservative Party, has kind of crowded towards the center, adopting more liberal policies, alienating that sort of red meat base of the party, with efforts made to sort of push the Conservative Party back to the right. But then with the apprehensions about how electable will that kind of party be. You know? This was O'Toole's comment on social media today. Well, you know, this would be we'd be the NDP of the right, you know, with the piece of good conscience on our own, but unelectable in relation to the Liberal Party. So those sort of political considerations come to bear as well. It'll be interesting to see what the Conservative Party does in terms of addressing this movement and perhaps aligning itself with the movement. One thing that I'll say that I think extends beyond this particular event and has global significance is what I refer to as the politics of grievance. And the politics of grievance, of being aggrieved, of feeling as if you and yours have something that's owed to you by right that's been taken away from you. Yeah? that this is a really powerful political motivator. This is the kind of sentiment that gets people into the streets. You know, we could have a debate about national pharmacare. Should Canada provide subsidized pharmacare equally to all Canadians? I think we could have that kind of policy debate. Someone say this, someone say that. But those sorts of policy discussions aren't so effective in getting people out to vote or out into the streets, as in this particular instance. But we saw, you know, with the MAGA movement in the United States, that feeling as if something has been taken away from you. Our jobs have been taken away from us by globalization and sending of industrial capacities offshore, or our jobs are being taken away from us by immigration from Central America and Mexico that degrades the quality of life in the United States. That gets people upset and excited. Yeah? Or that the Democratic Party, through this foisting of multiculturalism upon American society, is shoring up a base with which the Republican Party can't compete. The traditional forms of power are being taken away from people is a strong political motivator. So we've seen it, I think, in this particular event. Our rights, our freedoms, our charter rights have been taken away from us. We can't visit with family. Can't watch my kid play hockey. That was the real complaint here in North Bay, you know, being a hockey town, national sport, although skiing is better. I'm just saying. You know, you see the hockey sticks with the flags flying. That's what people are upset about, that they can't watch their kids play hockey, which is a really big deal for hockey moms and hockey dads to go and scream at other hockey moms and hockey dads. It's a Canadian custom. It's what we do, I guess. I'm not particularly proud of it. My dad said that I couldn't play hockey because he'd have to take up smoking if he was going to watch me play hockey. Back in the days when you could smoke in hockey arenas, yeah? Cross-country skiing, much better because the whole family can go at once, right? You're not just screaming at your kid to beat up some other kid, which is kind of how... does anyone play hockey here? I'm sorry for the hockey players. Okay. Yeah, cross-country skiing is much better. By the way, we have cross-country ski trails. Has everyone been out on those, the trails? We have 700 acres of forested escarpment that goes all the way back to Nipissing First Nation territory by the Lavasse River. We've got a waterfall on campus that's amazing in the winter and in the summer. Snowshoes are available from the Canada Gym, I believe. I know they've got a whole bunch of them. In the past, you've been able to borrow those for free with a student card. It's a good way to ensure your mental health. Go out and keep the company of some trees out there and see a waterfall. It kind of resets your day in a really healthy way. Yeah? And there are also groomed cross-country ski trails available free to the public. Mountain bike or fat biking is becoming a bit of a thing out there. Outdoor sports are fantastic, I think. Endurance sports, they're good for the heart, lungs, the blood, and they clear the mind too. Yeah? Anyways, yeah, back to the point at hand here, the politics of grievance. This is a powerful means of mobilization. We've seen it in MAGA, we see it here in this particular event. We see it in the rise of far right-wing ethno-nationalism in European countries, like Poland and Hungary, for example, with the rallying cry there being kind of anti-Islam sentiments, anti-immigration sentiments, that somehow traditional Christian Caucasian values are being diminished by the influx of Muslims into Europe. You know, that's been a source of ethno-nationalism in that country. Again, something of ours is being taken away from us, our identity, and that's been a powerful motivator in terms of electoral success for far-right parties in Poland and Hungary, for example. With an incipient danger, I would suggest, this comes off of our readings from last week from Musquili, that there's kind of an incipient neo-fascism that could be built into those sentiments as well. You know? Bundling together the people in opposition to those foreign others. We saw this in the United States with the Muslim ban, for example. And that was a powerful motivator for then President Trump's base. Who are we? Not them. We're not Muslims, although Muslims can be Americans. There's no there's a separation of church and state clearly in the United States, but you can see how that kind of political rhetoric plays upon people's worst inclinations. Yeah? And I would say too, to make maybe sort of to broaden this comparison, Al Qaeda and its affiliates also, whether it's Al Shabaab, whether it's Boko Haram, Al Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria. Western education is forbidden, the literal translation of Boko Haram. Not a term taken on by the group, but assigned to them by other Nigerians, as a kind of a slang. There's a sense of resistance to those foreign others, a kind of anti-Western sensibility in the case of Al Qaeda and its affiliates there. If you look at the the political manifestos associated with Osama bin Laden, the argument there was quite clear in terms of how to rouse the base. Ousting foreign installed secular dictatorships in the Middle East, regimes like Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime in Iraq, Mubarak in Egypt, and Hussein in Jordan, and ousting those propped up dictatorships and replacing them with Islamic theocracies as more representative of the indigenous will of the people. So who are we? Not them. It's a form of resistance there to Western imperialism and colonialism, and a repudiation of Western liberal secular values in the favor of theocratically inspired values. I think a very similar kind of politics of grievance takes place there, that the Middle East has been oppressed by the West, and the restoration of the caliphate, the restoration of a kind of medieval sensibility of the greatness of Islam, is a way of getting back to these origins and getting back behind the influences of the West on that part of the world. But the motivation is very similar in terms of rousing the base. This politics of grievance. Something has been taken away from us. That's what gets people in the streets, or that's what, in these particular kind of radical instances, might inspire someone to kill others, or indeed even kill themselves for that cause. This is, again, well beyond kind of policy discussions at this point. This isn't a matter of what's the best thing for the state to do. This is a matter of us versus them, and us being deprived of something that's suited to us by right and reason. Very powerful political motivator. The dangers, of course, are the ungovernability of it. If you define your political identity in terms of what you are not, who are you and who is allowed? We see this in the protests on Parliament Hill with the sort of hodgepodge of different forms of resistance to public health mandates, whether it's hockey moms wanting to get back into the arena, or whether it's white supremacists wanting to reclaim Canada. You've got a lot of diversity there, and there are a lot of people in between. I think for the most part, people are just chafing at public health mandates as infringements on their freedom. That's the bulk of it. But you have these other outlier elements as well. And how do you deal with them? We saw this when President Trump tried to respond to the affairs in Charlottesville. I don't know if you recall the far right, the Unite the Right march in Charlottesville, United States, where there were tiki torch wielding white supremacists chanting, "Jews will not replace us," just horrific. And with the president at the time saying, well, there's fine people on both sides of that debate. You had the left-wing protesters saying racists don't belong in our community, and you had these others claiming that their white identity was being suppressed by multiculturalism. You can't say that there are good people on both sides of that debate. You had a white supremacist running his car into a protest. You just condemn that outright, is what you do in those instances. But it became difficult for Trump to speak to his base in a way that would enlist their energies, not call out those bad actors within. Again, because if you define yourself in terms of what you're not, it's hard to say, well, what are you and what do you stand for? What are your principles here? What defines your group identity? We see this in Al Qaeda too. If you look at the evolution of Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's religious edicts, his fatwas, almost look moderate and conservative by comparison with, say, Al Shabaab in Somalia. we saw edicts coming out of, or fatwas coming out of Al-Qaeda saying, for example, avoid killing your fellow Muslims. Don't attack mosques or markets. Avoid indiscriminate violence. You can murder Jews and Christians and apostates, but not Muslims. You know? Attempt made to say, who are we here, at the very least. And you see those efforts completely disowned by the franchises, if you will, of Al-Qaeda, groups like Al-Shabaab, which have engaged in acts of indiscriminate violence, or ISIS, and then ISIS-K in Afghanistan, similarly, acting in a much more radical and indiscriminate fashion than its origin in Al-Qaeda. We see a kind of tendency towards the radicalization of these groups, where the more radical the position taken, the more attention that offshoot gets. Why would that be the case? Why would the radical, indiscriminately violent elements of a movement get more attention than the more moderate or concessionary elements of a movement? Yep. So it gets more media attention, okay, yeah.
Exactly, I was down that point. Like it's more shocking, like the shock factor. Yeah, it like makes more news basically.
Yeah, yeah.
I was gonna say like the same thing. Like it's just more of like a juicy story. Well, maybe not, but like it's just more like something to put on the news that's entertaining, or they see like, oh, there's these crazy people part of this protest. Maybe you shouldn't be aligning yourself with this protest. Like.
And that's been what the Conservative Party and other right-wing media outlets have said about that coverage, that why are you paying attention to these few crazy elements? Sure, you got a Confederate flag. Sure, you got a swastika over here. You got some drunk people peeing on a statue. But for the most part, we're fine folks, yeah? But that does get more clicks. It does get more media attention. Yeah, at the back.
Also, because it's things we're not used to seeing. A lot of the times, like you said, like compared to like a smaller thing, it's like, oh, we see that all the time. So then when something big happens, you can't help but look at it because you're like, oh, well, like I've never seen that before, so I want to talk about it. So then like what you said, like Ben goes around social media and then talks about it because it's like something new.
Yeah, you just cannot look away. It's difficult to. Yeah, there are all of those elements, and I think new media, digital media, has certainly accelerated those trends. We're going to talk more about the 9/11 attacks in September 11, 2001. Not incidentally, this is my first time teaching at University of Ottawa, teaching an international relations course, was September of 2001. So things were happening rather quickly in Ottawa at the time. Digital media was a new thing at the time. We had, in the first Gulf War in the 90s, the first generation of 24/7 news coverage with CNN coming on the scene around then. And then in the early 2000s, with the rise of social media, we have the possibility of global events. I would argue that we did not have global events properly so called until everyone in the world can witness events unfolding in real time and then respond to them, each in their own various ways there too. And I think this shift in political discourse towards ideological radicalization shifts us away from middle way or third way politics. Middle way. This language is the third way, presented by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, picked up on by our reading from last week, Anthony Giddens, as the sort of what will become the predominant logic of globalization between the far right and the far left. Can we establish more kind of technocratic solutions, if you will, that transcend ideological divisions? That was the hope in the mid-90s, which was really the beginning of the discourse around globalization. After the end of the Cold War, there's the sense that maybe we can move beyond these Cold War divisions between communism and capitalism. maybe we can share in the same interest. Everyone wants to live in a prosperous economy. Everyone wants to live in a world where you can freely travel, where you can be a citizen of the world, where you can enjoy the kind of cosmopolitan future, getting to know different people, different places. It's enjoyable. You know? It makes us more human, arguably, to be able to do that. Maybe all human beings essentially want the same thing, though, although our identities can vary you know, from people to people. Maybe there's something at the core that bridges these ideological divides. It becomes increasingly hard to see a kind of third way solution, a middle way solution, given this ideological polarization. We've seen this really bringing American political discourse to a grinding halt in the United States. And I think we see it in this particular event here in Canada too, where it seems hard to imagine how you would talk your way out of this. You know, how do you have a reasonable discussion between residents of Ottawa neighborhoods who feel terrorized and the truckers who are engaged in all-night parties in their neighborhoods? It's hard to see how you would have a civil discourse that would get you out of that, which is why we're in such an impasse presently. Yeah, with those protesters booking hotel rooms into next weekend now at this point and threatening to carry on until, well, they've released a manifesto with what was it, 200,000 signatures, I think the last count I saw, a manifesto calling on the Governor General and the Senate to connect with Canadians united to dissolve Parliament and oust the elected government to be run instead by this committee, self-established committee. Regime change, revolutionary regime change is essentially what they're calling for there. That's not going to happen. There's no way you can engage in a discussion on those terms. Justin Trudeau's not going to stand down and be tried as a war criminal. No, that's not going to happen. So what's the way out? How do we get out of this political impasse becomes a really real question. Wait them out? But what is their war chest now? What did they raise on GoFundMe? Eight?
Some questions. So the person who had control of that she was a Brexit Party member.
Mm-hmm.
She's disappeared and no one can contact her.
Ah, I hadn't heard that news.
So
Okay.
what the war chest is who knows at this point.
I saw a figure of
But it was $9 million.
$9 million.
9,689,450 out of the $10 million goal.
So that's their war chest at this point. So that would keep diesel in those trucks and coolers full of beer and pickup trucks for quite some time.
Well, last
Yeah.
I heard is that a large group of them, there's a group of Ottawa people who are listening into a number of different channels.
Hmm.
AVs, something called Zelo, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But they're organizing through this. And a bunch of the truckers today said if they don't get diesel by 10 a.m. today, they're leaving.
Oh, okay, that'd be good.
And that's where the thing came up. The guy was addressing them and saying, listen, we don't know where she is. We don't know if we have the money, but we'll try to get you the diesel. Please don't.
And even how do you get the diesel downtown
Yeah.
if roads are blockaded and no one can move, if there's gridlock? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I kind of blanked out for a second. Are we talking about, they're funding the people that are protesting?
Yeah.
And 10 million people, $10 million.
$9 million some dollars have been raised on GoFundMe.
For the trucks that are producing housing right now.
Yeah, promising to buy them basically diesel fuel and food so they can maintain their encampment as long as it takes for the government of Canada to fall, I guess, or all public health mandates to be removed, even though that's not a federal matter. You know, in terms of the border controls, that's a federal matter, but the public health mandates largely are provincial or, directed by public health units locally or institutions at the level that we're at here. So, yeah, where do we go from here? Again, the point I'm trying to make is that this politics of grievance may be attractive to political movements in order to rouse the base. It's difficult to direct those energies then. And it's difficult to see how they could be brought back into the fold of civil discourse and of democratic decision making, which is why I think this danger of incipient authoritarianism or neo-fascism remains present in all of these across the political spectrum, whether you're talking about Islamic fundamentalism, whether you're talking about the rise of the far right, ethno-nationalism. It's hard to see how things could get better by talking with these particular with these particular individuals. It's hard to see how things can get better through politics. And this is one argument that I'll make about international terrorism. I think one of the problems with the document that we have in front of us, the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, as I think the most important response to international terrorism. The problem with this approach is that it treated it as a matter of politics. It treated the September 11th attacks as a matter of war, rather than as a matter of criminality, which would be, I would argue, a more appropriate means of confronting international terrorism. These are criminal acts, and we shore up international institutions and international law. International institutions like the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for example, would have been an excellent mechanism for prosecuting the individuals involved in the 2001 terror attacks. Arguably, this security strategy gives too much credence to these groups by confronting them as an enemy, by confronting them on those political terms, and in such a way that you rouse the base. You give more fuel to the fire, in this case, by sending troops into Afghanistan and Iraq as a response to the September 11th attacks. So I would distinguish between matters of criminality here and matters of politics, properly so called. And this is obviously a challenge to us because this occurs precisely when cooperation on a global scale is needed to confront these shared challenges. Things like global pandemics, things like global climate change, things like nuclear disarmament, and things like international terrorism, which I would put to you are some of the most important security threats that is facing humanity presently. And these are significantly security threats that all nations confront, and that no one nation can confront on its own. How then could states respond in order to organize humanity on a global scale? Our readings from last week point to three options here. A world state, increasingly unlikely. There was some sort of premonition of this during the 90s with the United States unipolar moment, with the sort of idea being that the United States could bring order to the globe in a constabulary function, policing the world effectively. That didn't bear fruit. A renewed United Nations with the Security Council structurally changed to more adequately correspond to the current balance of power rather than the post-Second World War balance of power. That is another workable solution, perhaps. Can we make multilateral international institutions more effective at confronting these global challenges so that we have more buy-in from more of the nations of the world? Or, and this seems to be, in my mind, the direction we're pointing in. Yeah, did you have a question? Okay. The other option that Musquili presents is a great power concert, where great powers recognize their regional hegemony and their freedom to do what they will in their own neighborhoods at the expense of international law and international institutions. That seems to be the direction that we're heading in. And I would put to you that it has really dangerous consequences. That when powerful actors don't follow the rules of the game, sort of the fundamental tenets of realpolitik, realism, the idea that might makes right, that's what comes to bear at the expense of established norms and international law. And as the sort of intellectual forefather of international law, Hugo Grotius says, all things are uncertain the moment that men depart from law. In that anarchical environment, there's a great deal of uncertainty that attends. And I think we see the consequences of this presently. If we're reflecting on this situation presently in Ukraine, for example, with Russian troops massing at the Ukrainian borders, Russian troops massing in Belarus, I would trace that back to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That when the United States willfully flouted the will of the UN Security Council, violated international law, and engaged in an illegal war of occupation and regime change in Iraq it opened up the possibility for other powerful states to do the same. And we're seeing this bear fruit presently. And it's not a one-off event, what's happening in Ukraine presently. There's the 2014 invasion of Crimea, and further back, this was during the Beijing Olympics, I think 2008, the Russian annexation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, along very similar lines to what we see playing out now, with the allowance for that made by the United States breaking the rules itself. And so other powerful states say, well, if you can do that, we'll do the same thing in our neighborhood. And that may have really disastrous consequences. We can think of China and its relation to its neighbor, Taiwan, for example, perhaps unfolding in a similar direction here. If Russia can get away with it, what will other actors, great powers like China, try to do within their own neighborhood? And if the UN Security Council can't do anything about it, with Russia and China, along with the United States being 3 of the 5 veto-holding members, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, if Russia can get away with it, if the United States can get away with it, what's to stop China from doing the same? That's one of the consequences of breaking the rules. It helps when powerful states back the rules of the game. That's what adds credence and reality to them. Anyways, so on to the topic front and center of terrorism here, international terrorism. In our readings, we see international terrorism described as one of the vectors of globalization that poses dual challenges to the sovereignty of states. Obviously, international terrorism crosses over international borders and requires concerted action by states. And terrorist groups taking advantage of technological developments and technology transfers undercut the state's monopoly on the use of organized violence. It's a classical Weberian definition of what constitutes a state. And what I would put to you is that in terms of this threat, and the question being, is international terrorism an existential threat to states? In response to this question, the thesis that I'll try to push forward here is that the greatest threat to international terrorism is comprised of our responses, especially our institutionalized responses to it, i.e., who do we become in reaction to this threat posed by terrorism? Why might it be difficult, coming back to politics on the domestic scale, why might it be difficult for politicians to say that, though the September 11th attacks were terrible, 3,000 some people killed, attacks on the sort of symbolic center of American financial might, military might in the Pentagon, and political might in the White House, presumably the sort of the target of the third down plane, the fourth down plane. Why might it be a difficult political argument to make that we can take this? This is just 3,000 people. Many more people have died as a result of COVID than died as a result of the September 11th attacks. There's a moment in the United States where there's a September 11th every day. Why, though, would it be sort of politically difficult to make the case that this is not such a big deal? There's a few bad actors, terrible event, horrific, obviously, for New York, horrific for the families involved and for the first responders, but this doesn't shake us to our very core. This will not destroy the global economy. This will not destroy our civil society. This will not bring down liberal democracy in the West, if that's the aim of Al-Qaeda. We can take this. We can weather this blow. The kind of British World War II response, keep calm and carry on. Why would that be a politically untenable response to the September 11th attacks? Yep.
I was going to say, you're in the middle of kind of post-Cold War idealism about America, that they're the sole actor, they're untouchable, and it all comes crashing down in a pretty, I guess spectacular fashion, not in the sense of amazing, but in the sense that it is this kind of large event.
It's a spectacle, spectacular in that sense, yeah.
It's pretty hard to come out of that thinking, like, it's obviously a disruption to the American psyche more than
Although there was a great deal of international solidarity for the United States at that moment, where it became apparent that the United States could no longer see itself as Fortress America, that the problems of the world, the rest of the world didn't happen out there somewhere, but bore directly upon themselves. Maybe even with the apprehension that perhaps American foreign policy in the Middle East was experiencing some kind of blowback to American imperialism and the installation of despotic secular regimes in the Middle East. That maybe this wasn't out of nowhere, that this was connected in some ways to American foreign policy in the past. That would be a very difficult argument to make in the United States in the, on September 12th, 2001 as well. That would be seen as unpatriotic. So there's a kind of a rallying around the flag effect there as well. Yeah, Gavin?
Because America's often default position is to become more insular. So once the Cold War is over, isn't it kind of hard to even argue to Americans anything about foreign policy when oftentimes the population is more interested in being insular? That kind of isolationist undercurrent of American society?
Yeah, given the recalcitrance of the United States to enter both the Second and the First World Wars, given its geographical situation, a long ways away from any potential rivals or foes, it's been relatively easy for the United States historically to isolate itself from the world. That isolationist streak is persistent in American politics. We saw it through the Trump presidency, for example, with a diminishment of American leadership in terms of world politics. And in some ways, this is by no means a strong endorsement, but born out of a justifiable critique of foreign American interventions, say in Iraq, given the disastrous consequences of that failed war, or given the disastrous consequences of NATO involvement in Libya, and leading to the ouster of Gaddafi's regime there. Those events did not seem to work out well, either for the United States or its allies or for the region for that matter. And so, yeah, it's easy for the United States to be thrown back upon isolationism here. But that was clearly not their response to the September 11th attacks. Their response was to sort of capitalize on this unipolar moment, capitalize on the sort of geopolitical arrangement of powers in the post-Cold War era, where the United States had no real military rivals, with the aim of those policymakers behind the war in Afghanistan, but more importantly in Iraq, being to ensure a new American century where the United States would remain unrivaled for the next 100 years in order to effectively police the globe, removing regimes hostile to its interests and replacing them with regimes aligned with American interests and with institutions that matched the United States' own, spreading free market capitalism and liberal democracy the world over. That's how the Bush administration at the time took the event as a moment of opportunity to advance those aims that had been long held. They went back to the sort of Republicans' time in the political wilderness during the Clinton administration. Yeah.
I was going to say, because right prior to 9/11, isn't Bush, when he's running for president, does say he's against foreign intervention?
And nation building. He's not interested in it. Yeah.
So wouldn't it be that the post-Cold War idealism is itself a return to the kind of isolationist, and 9/11 is the break where it strikes such fear into them that they feel they need to not be isolationist anymore and begin to launch out?
Well,
I guess it's kind of like a point.
yeah, and there's the question too of who was pulling the strings there. Whether you can point to Bush's stump speeches running for president as an indication of what was on his mind. To what extent that was important is another question. Whether Vice President Cheney and the neoconservative cabal within that administration may have had outsized influence in terms of determining the course of action. With those figures, going back again to the Clinton administration when the Republicans were out of power, where those figures said, in response to the idealism of the post-Cold War era and the realization of a peace dividend, simple concept here, peace dividend. If we're out of the Cold War, if we don't need to arm ourselves against a rival superpower who's ideologically opposed to us, well then we can spend those riches on things that may be suited to our national interests and maybe are more amenable to our domestic politics. Rather, pivot from this Cold War rivalry to spending in more socially useful ways, realizing a peace dividend in that sense. And neoconservatives at the time, like Wolfowitz, like Cheney, and others, said, we're losing our advantage here. Why would you give up this preponderant advantage, this unipolar moment? Why not use this moment to get so much further ahead of China, especially, so that they will never threaten us again? They can't even hope to aspire to threaten us again. That was the sort of ideological bent of the neoconservatives that sort of played out during the war in Iraq as a response to that act of international terrorism. So moving to this document here, and maybe we'll get to the document after the break. Just to provide some context for it, I've given you the preamble to the document. It's included in the course readings on Blackboard there as well. It kind of sets the scene by staging this event in the context of the end of the Cold War. So the reading of the end of the Cold War, according to this security strategy, is that that conflict was a battle between the forces of liberty and totalitarianism, with a decisive victory being given to the forces of freedom over the forces of oppression. That's the narrative, the political narrative. And that US policymakers during the Clinton era were kind of asleep at the switch, if you will, and gave up their advantage, gave up that moment of opportunity, and unwisely committed the United States to multilateral commitments that would constrain its power to act. Things like commitment to the United Nations and the Security Council and international law, obligations there too. Commitments to the Kyoto and then the Paris treaties on climate change. Why would we make commitments that would limit the United States' economic development when there may be other actors who, like China again, for example, that don't have to take on these same commitments from these treaties, even if we are confronting the shared global threat of climate change. Commitment to international institutions and international treaties limits American power. And the path to progress is the path of unilateral action and historical resolve. Look, we're so strong right now that we don't need these international institutions anymore. We can do it alone. And we saw this rhetoric, after Secretary of State Colin Powell tried to make the case to the UN Security Council that the Iraqi government was flouting its obligations from previous UN Security Council mandates, that it was not allowing full access to its facilities, to International Atomic Energy Agency. IAEA inspectors, that Cheney argued that the UN Security Council was justified in acting and in providing a mandate for the United States to use force against Iraq. When that failed, Bush's response was that we will go it alone. That there would be a coalition of the willing, of willing partners, like the UK, most significantly, Denmark as well, that even if international institutions don't support this move, our allies will. And we're powerful enough to do it on our own anyways. And what are you going to do about it? We have a veto at the UN Security Council. So what means of redress does the rest of the international community have anyways? And you need us. You need us to confront this threat of international terrorism in an effective manner. And so you're either with us or you're against us. You're either with us or you're effectively aiding and abetting the terrorists by resisting these wars. The document reads, "History will judge harshly those who saw this coming danger, this union of radicalism and technology, but failed to act. In the new world we have entered, the only path to peace and action is the path, peace and security is the path of action. As we defend the peace, we will also take advantage of an historic opportunity to preserve the peace." So how do we find our way to world peace? When powerful states like the United States act towards that end with resolve, irrespective of international law or international institutions. That was the sort of course of action charted out by this particular document. 9/11 showed that the sovereignty of states was compromised by globalization and by its conduit technology. And hence, an international order founded on nation states, sovereign nation states, this is a core principle of the United Nations, that the sovereignty of states is inviolable, that states can only use violence against their neighbors to the extent that they are actually threatened, or to the extent that the UN Security Council mandates the use of force. These are the only two legal conditions under which force can be used by states against other states. The United States says those rules no longer apply. Those rules no longer apply. The sovereignty of states, which is the building block of the international state system, is an outdated principle. And so the United States took that as a justification for its violation of the sovereignty of Iraq. Now, admittedly, a vicious regime, a tyrannical, murderous regime that abused its own population, that abused the Kurds in the north, that abused the Shiites in the south. And so some justification was given also for the violation of Iraq's sovereignty by liberating the Iraqi people of a murderous dictator. It was part of the justification given. But clearly, that principle of state sovereignty was trespassed upon by the United States when it invaded Iraq in 2003. But again, according to this document, those old rules no longer apply. That bedrock principle of the United Nations, of the international state system, according to the authors of this document, no longer applied under these current circumstances. And so what's presented as an alternative to international law and mandates provided by the UN Security Council is the so-called Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine. The United States is justified in the preemptive use of force against potential future threats. This was a radical departure. That idea that preemptive defenses against potential future threats were justified fundamentally undid the international state system at the time. And again, I think arguably, if you were to look at, well, why is what's happening in Ukraine going on? Why, I would trace it back to this. Clearly, the Russian Federation doesn't respect the territorial sovereignty of the Ukraine, or Georgia for that matter, going back to 2008 again. But here that principle was undone. If Iraq potentially posed a threat at some point in the future, i.e., if Iraq were to have designs on acquiring weapons of mass destruction, which was the initial argument made to the UN Security Council by Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell, if they had designs, the United States was justified in preemptively invading and occupying Iraq to prevent them from acquiring those weapons of mass destruction. That was the argument made for this preemptive defense. Is this doctrine of preemptive defense justified in combating the sort of two avowed threats identified in this document, which are international terrorism and rogue regimes, tyrannical regimes? what do we make of this argument? And in Powell's case to the UN Security Council in the run-up to the war, he said, if you're looking for a smoking gun here, that Iraq possesses nuclear weapons, say, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction. What are we talking about? What are weapons of mass destruction? Yep.
Well, it's a number of different things. Nuclear weapons are kind of the most obvious answer, but large-scale use, kind of chemical warfare.
Chemical weapons, nuclear weapons.
I think there's a number of other types of bombs.
Biological weapons. Yeah, so you got 3 types of weapons of mass destruction, all characteristically indiscriminate, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants, obviously. And an affront to human dignity, an affront to international law, an affront to the principle of proportionality, that is, that the use of force has to be proportional to the threat posed, and an affront to the principle of distinction, again, between civilians and combatants. This is why these are such evil weapons, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons for these reasons. And so given the apprehension that Iraq might want to acquire weapons like this, and then even further, given the terrorized imagination, that these rogue regimes might pass these weapons on to non-state actors, might pass these weapons on to international terrorist groups. This is the real apprehension that informed this document, and I think is still presently with us to this day. This is, I think, the reason why I would say that the only route to peace in this regard is nuclear zero, global zero, the complete elimination of nuclear weapons altogether, because we have these new actors who would be willing to use them, new actors who would not have a return address, who cannot be deterred or contained, and who are not responsible to a domestic population that would bear the brunt of that retaliation. Given those circumstances, I would say that the only way to avoid this danger in a very real way is to get rid of these weapons altogether. And that would take the leadership of the United States and of Russia most significantly, along with the other permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which are the only 5 members of the international community that are recognized by the Non-Proliferation Treaty as legitimate possessors of nuclear weapons. It would require their leadership to give them up on their own and then force other states to do the same so that these weapons don't fall into the wrong hands. That's one way of dealing with this. The other way, presented here, is that the United States can use preemptive defenses to target those states that might want to acquire these weapons at some point in the future. Again, because the smoking gun would come in the form of a nuclear mushroom cloud. That's the argument that Cheney made here, why the old rules of the game no longer applied to international law, international state system was no longer adequate to confront this threat. The only way that we can confront this threat, according to this document here, is through the United States' unilateral use of force as a preemptive defense against these potential future threats. Let's come back to this as a point of discussion. I'd like to have us reflect on that question of whether this is a real justification for the use of preemptive force, and significantly the invasion of Iraq, this threat of the use of nuclear weapons by rogue regimes or their transit to non-state actors. Was the United States justified in this? I'd like for us to think about that, and we'll come back to that discussion. And then we'll dive into the text itself and go through some exegesis, read out of the text together, okay? But maybe let's take a little break. You can talk amongst yourselves. We've been denied that possibility for quite some time, or get a bite to eat or a cup of coffee or something like that. Let's take 15 minutes, and then we will reconvene, okay? All right, Hannah. Oh, there's a chat over here. Oh. Okay, so left off with consideration of the Bush Doctrine and of the idea that the use of preemptive defenses was justified given the threat posed by nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in the hands of rogue regimes or in the hands of international terrorists. And so the argument being made here that the old rules of the game, international law, the interstate system that had held back to the end of the Second World War, this was anachronistic in some ways and incapable of confronting these new shared threats. And so only American imperialism could fit the bill, and preemptive defenses were justified. What do we make of this argument that is at the core of the 2002 national security strategy, this Bush doctrine? Is that true? Is this argument for preemptive defense, which is the Bush doctrine, as a means of confronting these new shared threats, is this justified? Yeah.
I would say no. You've seen, I guess, a number of historic states try this. Rome, which caused imperial overstretch and helped, helped with the decline of the empire overall. This kind of,
We see in ancient Athens, the decline of the Athenian Empire through the Sicilian expedition is a preemptive defense of the growth of the power of Carthage. That led to imperial overstretch and the fall of the Athenian Empire. Arguably, this was the tipping point in terms of America's imperial overstretch and led to the decline of its unipolar moment, opening the door for other great powers like Russia and China to act similarly in their neighborhoods. So there's that. Now, under international law, is there a comment, question? Under international law, a preemptive defense is justified only given, quote, a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. This is what's known as the Carolyn Doctrine. Those words that I'm quoting. The Carolyn Doctrine outlines that norm of what constitutes a justifiable preemptive defense. There are roots of this that trace back to the origins of international law in Hugo Grotius and Aymeric de Vattel. But this is the kind of customary understanding. This arose from a dispute between Great Britain and the United States. And this is an issue we'll get into more in the Origins of International Relations course. But the point is that it may be justified to engage in armed defense before an attack occurs. That's the language of the United Nations Charter, justifying the use of force if an armed attack occurs. So we would all, I think, with the exception, are there any Christian pacifists or any other pacifists in the room? No? Okay. There's some argument to be made that there's no justification for the use of force whatsoever. You should turn the other cheek. But I think in terms of international relations, we would generally agree that if an armed attack occurs, a state is justified in using armed force to repel that attack. Yeah? That's one condition under international law, but that justifies the use of armed force. The other is a UN Security Council mandate. Okay? And so obviously neither of those two instances held here. The argument is that it's not enough that an adversary, even an avowedly hostile adversary, has weapons that could threaten you, perhaps even that those weapons are pointed at you and yours. That's not enough to justify the use of armed force. To preempt that attack, like they could use those weapons, they could not. Grotius uses the example of, you're alone in the woods and you encounter an armed assailant. Are you justified in killing or harming that person who threatens you? Someone threatens you with a sword and says, "Give me your wallet." Are you justified in killing or harming that person using armed force yourself as a response to that threat? What do we make of that? Are you justified? Would that be a just use of force? See a little nod here?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's someone with a knife, give me your wallet or else you could beat that person up.
They're threatening you.
Okay. Any other responses there? Yeah?
No.
No, why not?
Yeah, I mean, you don't actually know what the intention is. You know, I don't know. Well, you know, oftentimes people are afraid to actually do harm. You know, there is a certain level of empathy even in someone who's threatening you.
Mhm.
So you can never actually guarantee someone who's just, I don't know, maybe desperate, who's trying something, is really going to harm you or not. And also, you know, it's better to build a society where you don't have to contend with those things,
Mhm.
you know, where people don't go to those levels, than
Yeah.
to have the question in the first place. Which is to say, I guess, internationally, you should build an international order where those kinds of threats of violence aren't going to happen.
Mm-hmm. 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 You know, Thucydides, back to the history of the Peloponnesian War and the origins of Western political thought, he says the Greeks became civilized and they were no longer barbarians the moment when they no longer carried swords around with them. That for the longest time that it was customary in the Hellenic world to be able to defend yourself, to carry a sword with you. And the Greeks became civilized, the sort of beacon of Hellenic civilization, when they had enough trust in one another that they no longer had to rely on their own self-defense. So are there other means? Yeah, there's a hand at the back.
I was just gonna say, you know how you mentioned like, are you validated in like harming them or killing them?
Mhm.
And I was thinking like, I feel like there's no like valid reason for personally, like I would understand like if someone else did it, but I wouldn't feel okay like harming or especially killing someone else, even if they threaten me with like to injure me, especially for something as small as like a wallet. I wouldn't think killing them would be like a valid like response to them trying to like rob me.
Why not?
Because it doesn't balance out.
Okay.
Like if like I don't know, I feel really bad about it. Like even if they were gonna just like even if they were gonna hurt me to get what I wanted, like to get what they wanted, maybe I would like you know self-defense, right? But I wouldn't go to seriously harming them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd rather just give them say my wallet and let them leave than
Yeah.
harm them. Just because I personally wouldn't. I feel too bad about harming the person.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. There's the feel bad, the empathy. And Gavin, you mentioned this too. Is perhaps we could say this is attributed to the fact that every individual human being, as a bearer of rights, has inherent value, has intrinsic value. Yeah, and even though clearly you're not friendly with that person in that circumstance, you don't like them, you may have hostile feelings towards them, given the circumstances. Even still, even given their criminal action, they have certain rights. Like the right to life, for example. You could see why someone might be motivated. There's clearly a motivation at play there. Yeah. And you point to a principle which bears upon international law, which is the principle of proportionality. That, okay, the threat is my wallet. I don't even have a wallet. The threat is you losing your wallet. Okay, that's something that sucks. Basically, you got to go and place all your credit cards. There's a hassle there under current circumstances. Does everyone carry cash in their wallet anymore? Oh, if you do, okay, cool, okay. But the credit card company's going to deal with it, so no big deal. Here, have it. Obviously, again, a hassle, not something that anyone would choose, but that danger, that threat, losing your wallet, is not proportional to the reaction that you're taking, harming that person or killing that person. I'll give you an example more from international relations. In 2006, August of 2006, Hezbollah, operating out of southern Lebanon, took hostage 2 IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, soldiers. And in response to that act, that hostile act, Israel invaded southern Lebanon, engaged in a ground invasion, yeah, and bombed key infrastructure along the way. Arguably, according to international law, that action was not proportional to the threat that was posed. It was not necessary. It was just way above and beyond what was necessary given the circumstances. You could imagine all kinds of other things that could occur. Could you negotiate for the release? Well, no, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Hezbollah is terrorists. So there is all of that. But you could imagine a political resolution. You could imagine an exchange of prisoners, for example, as a way of mediating that particular conflict. And that's what this sort of description of a justifiable preemptive defense outlines that the response must be, again, given a necessity of self-defense, it's necessary that you defend yourself. There's nothing else you can do. Instant. This is not something that may happen in the future. This is something that's happening right now. Instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. So in the case of the robber in the woods that Grotius describes, well, I could give him my wallet. I could run away, maybe. Maybe I could dissuade him from using force in that particular instance. What do you make of that? You're saying this was justified. What do you think of that response?
Justified to the extent, like, just to defend your, like, if they're actually going to harm you, it's justified to the extent of defending yourself, and you don't have to kill them, or you don't have to really injure them, but enough to dissuade them.
Right. So, but the brandishing of the weapon, give me your money or else. Okay, if that's the circumstance, it's one thing if they were to certainly come at you. You could defend yourself clearly in that circumstance. And that's what the UN Charter describes too. If an armed attack occurs, states are justified in the use of armed force. But the mere brandishing of the weapon and threats made is not a justification. So North Korea launching a missile, for example, through a provocation, through a threatening gesture, certainly, would not be a justification for an armed attack on North Korea. There are other things that could be done. There's a potential future threat that's underlined there. What if they're capable of deploying those ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads? There are certainly concerns at play there. But there are other avenues that are still open.
I guess my immediate thought was just, it's a guarantee that an attack would happen. That's
Right. Right. So according to this, say if a missile is in flight and headed towards your territory, on the way, you would be justified under those circumstances in launching your own weapons in return, as long as the counterattack is proportional to the original attack. And with the assumption there being that then some kind of deterrent value can be included that would, if you know that there will be this response, perhaps states will be deterred from the use of force by that credible threat of retaliation. So that logic is kind of baked into this definition of what constitutes a preemptive defense as well. Now, yeah, please.
Sorry, but then by that logic, say if a country launches a missile,
Yeah.
and you launch one back, then you're just you're giving them the reaction they want, and then they're just gonna keep doing it again, and then you're just gonna start like a war. So that's why I was thinking if they launch one, then I wouldn't launch one back, because again I would feel bad, but also because if you don't launch one, then they wouldn't think to attack you again, because they're like, oh well, you didn't get the reaction we wanted, so why would we attack them again?
Huh, that's interesting. So you're taking a rather hardcore idealist, pacifist line there, with a kind of prudential argument included that would dissuade them somehow from attacking again or in the first place. I don't know entirely what you mean by that's what they were going for in terms of occasioning that response. Why would that be the desired response as a retaliatory strike?
So say I was going against you, right?
Please don't.
I offended you.
Okay.
You decided to strike me with a nuclear missile.
Okay.
So you decided to do that. And if I had retaliated and struck you with another missile, then you'd be like, oh, well, I can do it again because you caused destruction to me by striking me with a missile.
Mm-hmm.
But then if I wouldn't retaliate, then you wouldn't have a reason to do it again. You'd be like, well, I already retaliated for the other thing you did, so now I have no reason to be mad at you again.
Yeah, and oftentimes we do get those escalating patterns of violence where it becomes more and more difficult to bring a cessation to the conflict. Yeah, and it depends too upon the consequences. Yeah? When the pain of compliance outweighs the cost of engaging in the act of offense, then you can get the parties to the table. But as long as they can carry on doing what they're doing, they may continue to do so. So we see these grinding conflicts in Yemen, for example, or in Ukraine as well, going on and on, because it's not in the interest of either party to back down under the circumstances, given the concessions that they would have to make, which makes mediation, peacemaking, very difficult at points. You need to find overlapping interests, and it becomes challenging when you have bad actors who benefit from the conflict. You know? I would point you in the direction, if anyone's interested in conflict mediation, we offer in political science some really excellent courses, I think, in conflict resolution. Several of them with Dr. Hoffman. Is anyone taking courses with Dr. Hoffman? A few have? Okay, excellent. I like what he's doing in that he comes from a background in conflict resolution, in mediation himself. Through the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiations, teaches international negotiation skills. And this is the kind of thing that his research and advocacy are focused on. How do you find that middle ground? How do you deal with bad actors? He tells the story. His father, Ben Hoffman, engaged in talks with Joseph Kony. People recognize this name, Joseph Kony, Lord's Resistance Army. Yeah.
There was the push right before he kind of disappeared, I think, from sickness. The big public campaign in 2012.
Yeah, led by Michelle Obama, I think, was involved in that campaign. Yeah, release the children.
But yeah, he'd been operating for a long time. I remember people at night, was it Kenya he was operating in?
Uganda, northern Uganda.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
He's
back and forth. The Lord's Resistance Army is back and forth across borders there, but yeah.
I remember people used to have to walk their kids to cages at night to keep them safe because they would kidnap them in the night.
Yeah, that was their modus operandi. Raiding villages, kidnapping children, and forcing the females to be sex slaves and the males to be child soldiers. That was what they did. A particularly vicious group. There was this push to release the children, and Ben Hoffman was one of the only people who negotiated directly face to face with Joseph Kony. He learned after the fact that he's in the jungle sitting with Joseph Kony and all of his henchmen, that Kony had earlier in that day killed his cousin with a machete, and now he's sitting down to talk with him and say, release the children. Yeah? In any case, he was unfortunately unsuccessful, but the sort of skills that would be required to convince a murderous individual like that to back down are the kinds of skills that Professor Hoffman tries to teach in his courses. So if you have any interest in involving yourself in mediation, also involved in land claims disputes, involving First Nations here in Canada too, so highly recommended. But we're always looking for those politically mediated diplomatic solutions. It's difficult to see circumstances where you can fight your way to peace, short of the complete elimination of the enemy or their complete cowing. And this is not the likely outcome. Let's turn to this document together, the one I've distributed here, the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, the document that kind of broke this rule, that violated this logic of what constituted a justifiable preemptive defense. We'll begin at the preamble here and just move through. What we're doing here is exegesis. Exegesis. That is, we're reading out of a primary source. We're interpreting the text. This is the kind of thing that I'd like you to do in your written assignments. Provide quotations from the text, and then interpret them, okay? I've mentioned this preamble before. The Cold War is over, and the United States won. The great struggles of the 20th century between liberty and totalitarianism ended with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom and a single sustainable model for national success. Freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. It's a really unusual beginning for a national security strategy, because here we're talking about ideology. We're not talking about national security, we're talking about ideology and the fact the United States won the Cold War. What does that sentence indicate? How would we read that particular opening sentence? Yep.
I'll read it as like they want it, but I guess they're trying to let it not repeat itself, basically.
I'm sorry, it's not a.
Like the United States won, and they're trying to, I guess, dissuade other people from doing it, like strengthen themselves to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
They're definitely saying they won the Cold War. Yeah? Not only did they win it militarily and economically and technologically, but that what that event demonstrated, that decisive victory demonstrated, is that there's a single sustainable model for national success. How would you read that? Yeah, Kevin?
Well, I always would go to Fukuyama. That's clearly a document that comes from the end of history.
Yeah.
Where there is only one logical conclusion to history, and that's liberal democracy.
Yeah. This is the famous end of history argument from Francis Fukuyama, influential within the neoconservative cabal of American foreign policymakers. Fukuyama, devotee of Alexander Kojève, sort of the father of, one of the progenitors of European postmodernism, taught a famous seminar course on Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, and promoted this idea that world history was marching in a singular direction, that human beings are essentially free and equal, and historical progress can be measured by the worldly realization of our freedom and equality. And so Kojève came to that realization, teaching this seminar on Hegel, said basically, well, philosophy is over now. We know what history is about. Philosophy is the question, what is wisdom? What is the good? Kojève says, I know what the good is. Done and dusted. We're settled on that. So he became a European Union bureaucrat, negotiating trade deals between France and Japan, actually. Spent some time there on behalf of the French Foreign Ministry, drinking the finest wines, staying in the nicest hotels, marching the world towards this universal and homogeneous state, this end of history, where we all want the same things and where we all enjoy the same political institutions. The end of history here is the global spread of liberal democracy and free market capitalism. Basically, the rest of the world catching up with the United States and becoming more like them. That's the model, yeah.
I was gonna add to that, basically in this first sentence, the United States is basically asserting that their system and their democracy is the one
What a
single
good
model,
boy.
and
Oh my
that
god, they're
obviously
learning so
then,
quick.
establishes the enemy
They're
as
so
well.
sweet. I cannot wait for
Because
LA
they're
Pilot to meet
saying,
them.
this is the single sustainable model, and then freedom, democracy, free enterprise, and so
Sweet. I cannot wait for
and
LA
then
Pilot.
obviously we're gonna get into
What a
the
good
other
boy. Oh my god, they're
terms
learning so
of
quick.
that state.
Yeah. Anyone who doesn't match up with the American version of progress is an enemy of freedom.
Yeah.
And we'll get to those security threats here in a moment. Why did the 9/11 attackers bring down the World Trade Center and attack the Pentagon? According to Bush, it's because they hate our freedom. That was the sort of off-the-cuff remark that he made, but this was, I think, sort of deeply embedded in their way of thinking about the world and America's relation to the rest of the world. Why did they hate us? Because they hate our freedom. This was the argument made at the time. In the 21st century, only nations that share a commitment to protecting human rights, basic human rights, and guaranteeing political and economic freedom will be able to unleash the potential of their people and assure their future prosperity. The document recurrently links political and economic freedom. You have the freedom to choose Coke or Pepsi. You have the freedom to choose Republican or Democrat, and those go hand in hand. Yeah, and maybe even in authoritarian regimes. This is the sort of policy of constructive engagement. Even in authoritarian regimes, if there are these incursions of free market democracy, perhaps people will take on the habits of freedom and first, have the pleasure of choosing Coke or Pepsi, and then want to choose their own government based upon that freedom that they've enjoyed at the economic level. The document recurrently goes back and forth between economic and political freedoms in that sense. It links them. People everywhere want to be able to speak freely. So we're making universal claims here. Everyone desires the freedom to speak. Choose who will govern them, worship as they please, freedom of religion, educate their children, male and female. Of course, this was, from a Canadian perspective, the only justification for the war in Afghanistan left standing at a point. Equal access to education for women and girls in Afghanistan. And this, I think, was our kind of national shame, given our, the return of the Taliban regime, the fact that women will continue to be oppressed in Afghanistan. Own property and enjoy the benefits of their labor. So these are how freedoms are described. Again, some of those political, some of those economic. These values of freedom are right and true for every person in every society. And the duty of protecting these values against their enemies is the common calling of freedom-loving people across the globe and across the ages. So this is an historical march here, a long historical march. All of history is given meaning and its end by contributing to that goal. And these are universally shared in goals. And to the extent that they're not, that's the work of the enemies of freedom coming to bear. What do we make of this argument? It's again, quite an astonishing opening set of claims for a document that's supposed to be about American national security. This real grandiose vision of the course of world history and the end of ideology, effectively. What do we make of that argument? Everyone wants the same things. Everyone desires freedom.
It's naive.
It's naive, you think? Why?
I just don't think it's true. I don't think people all want the same thing. I think it's pretty evident what's going on right now in reaction to COVID. I think it's pretty evident with the fall of Afghanistan that simply just, I mean, isn't true. I mean, if you look at Iraq, the attempts to impose democracy on Iraq hasn't really worked. And it's because, you have to build traditions that want democracy.
That's an argument that's often made, that there wasn't a democratic political culture. And indeed, tyrannical regimes are based upon the cultivation of mutual suspicion. That you can't trust your neighbors because anyone could be an agent of the state. You don't see free and open discourse in these closed regimes. They're, again, premised on the monopolization of the public sphere by one person or one party, and by sowing distrust among citizens. So if that's the situation, civil society is hard to build up. Trust, mutual trust, is really hard to build up. Really quick to break, really hard to build. Yeah?
I just think, like, oh God, now
I'm sorry, I went on with that. But you had your hand up for a bit. Yeah.
No, I definitely know what I was going to say.
Okay.
Okay, so, like, it kind of sounds like they're just, like, trying to, like, impose their way, or their, maybe not impose, but, like, they're trying to make, like, the universal claims that their model is, like, the best and, like, well-suited, when, I mean, if you look at the United States themselves, like, they also should look inward and look at their own system and see that that doesn't even work for themselves.
That's one argument against Fukuyama, that the United States isn't the sort of beacon of equality and freedom that it claims to be.
That they think.
That there are inequalities within that particular society that could be addressed.
Yeah, like, and, like, whether or not they're, like, assuming everyone wants the same thing or not, I feel like it doesn't matter. Like, why don't they just, like, it still doesn't change the fact that liberal democracy is not the be-all, end-all of humanity, or, like, not the end of history. Like, I don't think it's going to bring global prosperity, but that's just me. But I don't think it's going to bring, like, global prosperity. I think that's, like, idealistic.
It's a pattern of thinking associated with, in terms of economic development, what's referred to as modernization theory. We've talked about this a bit. Modernization theory, that through the transfer of technologies, we talked last week about the electrification of economies and industrialization of economies, the integration into the global economy, that states will naturally advance. Others argue that integration into the global economy comes at the expense of relations of dependency. rather than equality. You know? If you get stuck in the situation of being an oil exporting country, for example, you're at the mercy of international oil markets. That particular industry tends to promote social inequality and can promote corruption and graft as well. That doesn't bode well for the development of civil society and the sort of fulsome realization of freedom and equality domestically. It creates relations of dependency within countries and between those developing countries and the developed world. Yeah, Gavin?
I was just going to say, just as like a strike against modernization is, we've seen that attempt in China, and at no point have they ever gleaned at looking at becoming a different style of government. They continue to, they've developed quite a bit. Probably one of the more advanced economies in the world right now, but they still haven't liberalized in any way.
Yeah, and that was the kind of faith at this point in the mid to late 90s, even the early 2000s, that engagement economically would gradually lead to the spread of political freedoms as well. And that logic hasn't seemed to have borne fruit, is the reality of things here. But this is how the document begins. American freedom as the model for the rest of the world in terms of its development. Today, the United States enjoys a position of unparalleled military strength and great economic and political influence. This is a so-called unipolar moment. It's a condition of unipolarity. One power, as opposed to a multipolar arrangement of powers. In keeping with our heritage and principles, we do not use our strength to press for unilateral advantage. We do it for the benefit of the world as a whole. We seek instead to create a balance of power that favors human freedom. Balance of power. I think most of you have probably seen this language before. Balance of power, associated with the realist school of thought in international relations, often associated with a condition of multipolarity, with the idea being that the ascendancy of one power would invite other states either to band together to counter that rising power or to increase their own power themselves so as not to be oppressed, so as not to fear aggression from that rising power. That's how balance of power is normally described, as a kind of balancing act, kind of you can imagine a scale with opposing powers on alternate sides with a natural inclination, given the power-seeking nature of human beings, to balance out the power of others. This is a weird use of balance of power here. This is a balance of power where the United States has the balance of power by being the preponderant power. It's a very unusual use of this particular fixture term within international relations, balance of power. Balance of power that favors human freedom. Conditions in which all nations and all societies can choose for themselves the rewards and challenges of political and economic liberty. Again, note that association. In a world that is safe, people will be able to make their own lives better. We will defend the peace by fighting terrorists and tyrants. Okay, now we come to something like national security. Right? Who are the enemies? Keep in mind, too, that why is this an important discussion now? This is always at the center of any sort of national security discussion. Who are the enemies? Who are our enemies? Why would that be a pressing discussion at this particular moment for the United States? It's kind of an obvious question, yeah?
Well, oh, maybe this isn't answering your question. I was just gonna say, they're establishing the enemy as they're not like treating those people that acted as criminals. Oh my
Avalanche.
God.
Don't hang around there. That was exciting, yeah.
They didn't say like it was like they're not like specifying that those people were those people who committed 9/11 were like criminals. They're saying like they're the enemies of freedom. Like they're just people like referring to terrorists as anyone that's an enemy of, like, freedom.
Yeah, it kind of takes this event. This is 2002, 1 year after the 9/11 attacks, right? So obviously it's trying to come to terms with this, pivoting American foreign policy towards this new apparent threat, and trying to cast it in the language of the Cold War, where now the terrorists are the enemies of freedom, whereas before it was the godless communists who were the enemies of freedom, the Soviet Union. So the terrorists kind of slip in where the Soviet Union was before. You know? Now you could argue that, you mentioned that terrorists are criminals, and indeed these are criminal acts to willfully target civilians. These are not acts of war; these are criminal acts. They're illegal in the United States and internationally. So there's that. But part of this rhetoric, and there's a rhetorical dimension of this dialogue, is for old Cold Warriors used to having a very clear understanding of what the world's about. During the Cold War, it was kind of handy that you could understand every conflict in terms of the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. And with the non-aligned countries kind of finding their way out of that, but even still, by saying you're not aligned with that fight, you're contextualizing yourself in relation to the Cold War. You have these old Cold Warriors saying, who are we going to fight next? It's international terrorism. And again, this comes back to that question I sort of started off with earlier on. Why not just say that we can deal with this? We can confront this threat. This isn't an existential threat, really. It's a terrible crime, certainly, but it doesn't bring our civilization to a halt. We will carry on, keep calm and carry on. No, this is a way of justifying Cold War military budgets in a post-Cold War era. I think at a very mercenary level, that's the effect of this particular document, to say terrorists are the new communists. Interesting, though, that they link terrorism and tyranny. That's kind of strange. Tyranny is coeval with political life. There have been tyrants back to the origins of Western political thought, certainly. And I think this is a phenomenon that has cross-cultural significance. There are always some who want to lord it over others and desire power at the expense of others. Yeah, Gavin?
I was going to say, this is right about the time when they're justifying invading Iraq too, though, right? So they're trying to connect the Taliban to Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Taliban fits more into the tyranny side of things.
Yeah.
They don't have full control of the country.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda are stateless actors.
Yeah.
So would that be something with it's more of a mercenary point than maybe ideological?
Yeah, we are getting into more practical matters here. Now we're identifying threats, and we're linking terrorism and tyranny. We're linking non-state actors and state actors. Those tyrants are heads of state, like Saddam Hussein or like the Taliban. Now there are some tyrants who are friendly to American interests, like say Mubarak in Egypt, but they're set aside kind of conveniently here. The others on the watch list coming out of this document are, Iran and Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, are included in that axis of evil, so-called here, and are put on watch effectively. Why would the United States try to link non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, transnational terrorist organizations that had a convenient base of operation in Afghanistan, but we see now affiliates in many of the ungovernable parts of the world in what we would call failed states? Why would they try to link a non-state actor with a state actor here? It's kind of a strange linkage, tyranny and terrorism. You could say that neither of them really are fans of freedom, but beyond that, yeah, the back.
I could be completely wrong, but maybe have an excuse so that they could say an excuse to go to war with tyrants also.
Yeah. Gavin mentioned earlier that this is part of the lead up to the justification of the war in Iraq. There's that element. The United States made rather quick work of deposing the Taliban and directing their efforts towards counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations targeting members of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda leadership in Afghanistan. They were quite quick to accomplish those ends. Why would they want to target states rather than the sorts of groups that were responsible for the September 11th attacks? Yeah?
Because those sorts of groups really aren't the big threat.
Do you think the tyrants are more of a bit, like was the Taliban a threat?
I would say like tyrants like that don't share like the American worldview would be more of a threat than terrorists
Why?
to America.
Why would you say that?
Maybe because they like, I don't know, because I feel like the U.S. like they're not really touchable anyways. Like from like a security standpoint, like I feel like another country can't take on the United States. I'm not saying a threat in that way,
Yeah.
but more of a threat maybe
Bless you.
to like the ideology
Well,
or the spread of like Western ideology.
Yeah, they do lead in with this sort of historic dimension to the march of free market capitalism and liberal democracy as an American foreign policy objective. They lay that out in ideological terms. But in terms of security, what threat did Iraq pose to the United States? None, really. No? They had, they had in the past used chemical weapons against their own population, against the Kurds in the north, and against Iran. And the United States knew that because they had the receipts. They actively supported Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war, and the CIA aided Iraq in targeting the Kurds in the north with chemical weapons. So they knew about that because they were involved. Yeah, question at the back?
No, sorry, my brain blank.
Okay. Gavin?
I was going to say, isn't there, I think I remember there being internally a dialogue about the spectacle of war, that if you go against terrorists, it's hard to show in a 24-hour news cycle American success because it's very cloak and dagger when you're attacking caves. Where you attack Iraq, there's images of dropping bombs on key infrastructure. It's more of a tangible image to attack.
Pardon me? Yeah? Yeah.
Kind of more generalizing, right?
What do you mean by that?
Just picking a broader spectrum and just placing that on top of it just so you can connect it if you want.
There's, to a person with a hammer, the whole world is a nail waiting to be hit. And if you have the world's largest military, militaries are good at, states are, frame their defenses contra other states. Militaries are blunt instruments. Effective at, deposing regimes. The United States was quite effective at regime change in Afghanistan and Iraq. Much less successful in nation building because militaries are not suited to those sorts of enterprises as well. But arguably, if you're talking about identifying criminal elements, there are more precise ways to do that than by dropping bombs or invading a country. That would require extradition treaties, might be a good way to go about this. There were talks involved between the Taliban and the United States, and the Taliban wasn't a monolith. It still isn't. There's contestation within it, as any governing regime. There were elements within the Taliban saying, if this is the threat that we will be invaded, let's give them up. Let's give Osama bin Laden up. Perhaps he could be extradited to a third party like Iran and put on trial there. The United States was not at all interested in that. There were sort of cooperative multilateral efforts to freeze Al-Qaeda finances, to, again, identify the individuals involved and to bring them to justice would have been a suitable course of action, but that's not the course of action they took. They took a military course of action. They targeted states. And at a point, when the United States' attention in Afghanistan kind of slipped, Rumsfeld made the comment that there's just nothing left to bomb there anymore. And you can carry on counterterrorism efforts, but in terms of wins, there are no militarily significant targets any longer. So Iraq became the next focus. Yeah.
Also, just like it looks worse on them, but on any country team, like I don't know if this makes sense, but like to the U.S. on the U.S.'s like point of view, it looks it might like look worse to them being like, oh, like a terrorist group hates me, like oh that's not a big deal, but like oh Iraq hates me, then like I hate them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's easier to identify the enemy. You know, you're dealing with.
I feel like they care more that it's a country because it's like a whole country,
Uh,
and like people would look at it more because it's like oh it's an actual country that hates the U.S. so we can at least care more about it.
yeah, when you're dealing with these amorphous, networked organizations, and there are sort of different dimensions to how they were networked, like Al Qaeda, with its now numerous offshoots and franchises, it's less it's less amenable to identifying it in a way that you can point a finger at a state. Yeah, you can say that Iraq, Saddam Hussein, there's the enemy, regime change, cut off the head of the snake, and impose a friendly regime. You know, involved in extended counterterrorism operations, coordinated policing operations, clamping down on terrorist finances. That's kind of less politically sexy compared to being able to target and take down a state. And also, again, considering the weapons at hand, what can the United States do? They proved themselves really effective at deposing unfriendly regimes. Again, much less effective at installing sort of sustainable democratic experiments in those countries. But the point here is that the authors of this document are linking a non-state actor, international terrorism, with a state actor, a tyrant, and framing both within this overarching context of this march to freedom and equality led by the United States. Let's just jump down here. Bottom of the page. To defeat this threat, we must use every tool in our arsenal: military power, better homeland defenses, law enforcement, intelligence, vigorous efforts to cut all terrorist financing. Those elements are involved too. The war against terrorists of global reach, the so-called war on terror, is a global enterprise of uncertain duration. What does that say about the war on terror? It is a global enterprise of uncertain duration. It's a war without end. They were very upfront about this from the beginning. Yeah? There will always be elements, whether state actors or non-state actors, hostile to the United States. The United States tends to engender this kind of blowback to its foreign policy, especially when it comes to imperialism and colonialism, especially when it comes to propping up tyrannical governments. So this will have no clearly defined battlefield, and it will have no definitive end. There will be no sort of mission accomplished moment here. That was a promise made from the outset. And as the United States learned in Afghanistan, it may be that military success engenders those kinds of responses. Yeah. Oh, no. America will help nations that need our assistance in combating terror, and America will hold to account nations that are compromised by terror, including those who harbor terrorists, because the allies of terror are the enemies of civilization. So the United States will make no distinction between those who provide sanctuary to terrorists, like the government of Afghanistan, and the terrorist groups themselves. They will identify those state actors and non-state actors as common enemies of civilization. And here, in this next paragraph, is this famous Bush doctrine described. The gravest danger our nation faces lies at the crossroads of radicalism and technology. Our enemies have openly declared that they are seeking weapons of mass destruction, and evidence indicates that they are doing so with determination. That's the concern, that these non-state actors would acquire weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons, and be willing to use them. The United States will not allow these efforts to succeed. We will build defenses against ballistic missiles and other means of delivery. This has become a thorny issue in terms of American-US relations, in the integration of our shared defense of North American airspace, or NORAD. This desire expressed at this moment and expressed throughout the Bush presidency to develop a national missile defense system designed to protect the United States from ballistic missiles. There was great apprehension in Canada that the development of this kind of system would lead to the militarization of space, that it would contravene existing arms control treaties, which it did. The United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in order to engage in the development of this system. Perhaps further, that it wouldn't be effective. It's difficult to shoot down a bullet with a bullet, short of using nuclear interceptors, or again, putting weapons in space, which could lead to an arms race in space, which would have damaging consequences in terms of international peace and security. But this is a centerpiece of this document, a national missile defense system to reestablish a kind of fortress America. And that seems like a kind of reasonable thing to do. You know, if North Korea is testing ballistic missiles, if it's developing, if it can, detonate nuclear weapons, why wouldn't Canada and the United States field these sorts of defensive weapons? Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? Yep.
Well, for Canada, there's always kind of running the question of identity and kind of our connections to this state, whether it's kind of, I guess, a colonial relationship. Oftentimes, it feels like our institutional capacity is reduced so that it's given to the states. So I think when you start taking away distinctive security, you start to erode the kind of sovereignty of your country.
This is the question that's front and center in George Grant's Lament for a Nation. Should Canada cow to American demands to have nuclear weapons on Canadian soil? For a brief period of time, there were nuclear weapons here in North Bay, the Beaumark missiles, designed as interceptors to prevent the Soviets from invading over the Arctic. And this became a hot election issue here in Canada between the Liberal and Conservative governments, with, in Grant's assessment, the Diefenbaker government, the Conservative government at the time, falling because it refused to fall in line with the Americans. And with Grant's argument being that really, given the closeness of American and Canadian society, there's no place for an independent Canadian foreign policy. That's Grant's argument. And now we don't have nuclear weapons presently on Canadian soil. Canada doesn't have nuclear weapons. We're a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and abide by our treaty commitments in that sense. Though we are world leaders in terms of the peaceful use of nuclear power, our CANDO reactor program, which we share, again, according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty with other states, so they can enjoy nuclear power as well. But this has been a pressing issue in terms of Canadian-American relations. Can Canada assert itself against the United States? And this became a hot issue after this document came out, with Canada looking for, well, as if we would fall in line here and participate in a national missile defense program, and with really widespread street protests here in Canada pushing back. I think this is one instance where there was a real effect of civil society mobilization, peace protests, and an abrupt change of course by our government. The context of a minority government, approaching an election, I think had something to do with it there. But there's a lot of pressure for Canada to fall in line. Again, considering that there's such a deep integration of Canadian and American forces in terms of the defense of North American airspace, there's an apprehension that we would be cut out of that agreement and suffer as a result. Thankfully, I would say the protests had their effect, and Canadian sovereignty was maintained in that particular instance. Just to finish off here, though, there's more to it than national missile defense. Just down a bit here. And as a matter of common sense and self-defense, America will act against such emerging threats before they are fully formed. Before they are fully formed. So we cannot wait for these hostile actors to acquire these weapons. We need to act in such a way as to prevent them from acquiring them in the first place, thus justifying this preemptive defense and justifying the invasion of Iraq on that basis. Arguably, I'd say, with real impacts in terms of the destabilization of the international order, leading to consequences that we see unfolding presently. Again, I think the threat of international terrorism has has a lot to do with how we respond to it, how we embed that threat in our own institutions in the ways that are described here. All right. Thank you so much for your attention and for your discussion, and we'll meet again next week. If anyone wants to talk about their assignment, I can stick around for office hours after class here. Yeah. All right. See you later, Hannah.